You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme. Just days away from the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, the Chancellor gives air travel a boost with a cut to air passenger duty. And there's disappointment at the lack of green measures in the budget too, as the Prime Minister says the COP is in the balance. Meanwhile, southern Italy and Sicily recover from a rare cyclonic storm, but forecasts suggest more severe weather ahead. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Climate campaigners are questioning the Chancellor's decision to cut air passenger duty on domestic flights in today's budget. Of course, that announcement comes just days before the UK hosts the annual Global Climate Summit in Glasgow. And while an increase in duty on long-haul flights might cancel out higher emissions from more domestic air travel, critics say giving travellers high carbon options simply won't help accelerate a reduction in overall emissions. Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, joins us now from Westminster. Hello to you, John. Now, what message does this tax cut send to the public about air travel?
Well, what the government is arguing is, of course, that long-haul flights cause more damage than short-haul flights. Now, in his budget speech, when he made his announcement about cutting air passenger duty for domestic flights, he said that people pay more for return flights within the four nations of the UK than they do from flying from abroad. And he says he's going to bring this in from April 2023, so it's not yet. He says it'll help the cost of living. 9 million passengers see their duty cut by half, he'll say. It'll bring people together across the UK. He also said it was a boost for regional airports like Aberdeen, Belfast, Inverness, Southampton, he said. What the government has also said is that international travel counts for 8% of emissions, whereas domestic flights only count for 1%. And so that's how they're justifying it. I have to say, during the budget debate, the SNP leader, Ian Blackford, led the assault on this move. He said it was a disgrace. He said, as COP26 kicks off this weekend, what on earth are we doing? We're saying to the rest of the world. The Prime Minister has spoken today about 1.5 degrees. So a lot of criticism of this, also from green groups as well. So it's a very controversial move just before the COP summit.
Yeah, John, also the Chancellor, of course, being criticised for this lack of a green focus in his budget, just days from COP, as you say. Is this a strategy or a sign that things aren't being taken seriously?
Well, that's what critics say. Critics are saying it's a missed opportunity. Now, among the critics later in that debate were the former Prime Minister, Theresa May. She criticised the lack of green skills, helpful green skills in the economy. She said she talked about the green industrial revolution isn't just about providing support for business. It's about the green skills of the future. Now, earlier, standing in for Sir Keir Starmer, who tested positive for COVID, minutes before Prime Minister's questions, Ed Miliband, the Shadow Business Secretary, former Labour leader, one of the government's biggest critics on COP and the environment, laid into Boris Johnson over the whole preparations for COP. Now, a couple of days ago, when he was talking to some children, the Prime Minister said a success for COP was touch and go. This was what the Prime Minister said in response to Mr Miliband.
COP26 is both unbelievably important for our planet, but also very difficult. And it's in the balance. We've moved from only 30% of the global economy committed to a net zero by the middle of the century to now 80%. And every day as I talk to international leaders, we hear further commitments to make those solid commitments that the world will need. Whether it is enough, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it is too early to say.
Well, critics will say it's a bit late now because, of course, it's only a few days till COP starts at the weekend. Tomorrow, on day 2 of the budget debate in the House of Commons, it's Kwasi Kwarteng, the Business and Energy Secretary, who is opening the debate, and Mr Miliband will again be no doubt on the attack. We can expect to hear a lot more criticism of the move on passenger duty, flight tax being cut for domestic passengers, and of course on the lack of a green strategy. And of course it'll probably be the last opportunity for MPs to debate COP before it actually gets underway. So the Prime Minister said earlier in the week, touch and go. Today he's saying too early to say. Is it all about managing expectations? Cynics will no doubt claim it is, but on the other hand, it could be that the Prime Minister is worried that there are some setbacks on the way, and it may not be the success that the government is hoping for.
John, an important few weeks ahead of us. Thanks very much indeed. Now, parts of southern Italy and Sicily are braced for more severe weather after a rare cyclonic storm hit the region. At least 2 people were killed when torrential rain caused widespread flooding around the city of Catania. The Italian Met Office says the storm is expected to peak tomorrow and Friday, when gale force winds will create a coastal storm. Sky's Emma Birchley reports.
Wading waist high through the murky gush of floodwater, a passerby leads a man to safety from his abandoned car. The unremitting rain has turned streets like this one in the Sicilian city of Catania into rivers, as residents were urged not to risk leaving their homes. A rare cyclonic storm has caused the downpours, but it didn't stop some venturing out despite the warnings. For many in the region, the clear-up has already begun. Belongings piled high away from the muck left behind. Carmela Mondio described what had happened as a catastrophe. Plenty of water entered my house in these 2 days, inside the drawers, on the floor, she said. There is still mud because we haven't managed to clean it. It's not the first time Samantha Seminara has been through this, and it's hard to cope with. We are trying to save as much as we can, she said. Nobody gave us anything. Here, everything comes from my sacrifices and the sacrifices of my husband. Further south in Scordia, rescuers have been searching for the wife of a 67-year-old man already found dead in an orange grove after their car was swept more than a mile in 2 metres of water. Another man who was 53 also drowned elsewhere in floodwaters after reportedly getting out of his car. The Sicilian Farmers Association says nearly a foot of rain fell on the island in just a few hours on Sunday, and there's no let-up in sight, with red warnings for further rain and thunderstorms continuing into Thursday. Emma Birchley, Sky News.
Well, let's take a look at some of today's other climate news. And Insulate Britain says it will continue to disrupt traffic despite court injunctions banning the group from blocking key roads across England. Dozens of protesters were arrested this morning after they blocked 2 major roads into London, once again during rush hour. The group is calling on the government to insulate millions of homes to reduce emissions. With just days to go before COP26, MPs have taken part in a debate at Westminster Hall on climate education. They discussed how students could be taught about the climate crisis and learn the skills that are needed for green jobs. Labour MP Nadia Whittome, who tabled the debate, called it the first step towards making climate education a legal requirement across the curriculum. And it's emerged that the UK has invested in a fossil fuel project in Mozambique whose emissions were assessed against a target of 2 degrees of global warming rather than the internationally recognised 1.5 degrees. The project involves a liquefied natural gas plant in the Cabo Delgado province, which campaigners say contradicts the UK's commitment to cut emissions. The news comes, of course, the week before the UK hosts the COP26 climate talks. The government has made the aim of the talks to keep the 1.5 degree ambition alive. And you can find the full story on the Sky News website. Now, China has warned that shifting its energy mix from coal to renewables will be challenging and cannot be accomplished overnight. It comes a day after its government released a new action plan which details how it will meet its target of peaking carbon emissions by 2030. Sky's Tom Cheshire has the latest from Beijing.
I think a lot of people were hoping for something big from China ahead of COP26, perhaps new pledges, but we certainly haven't had that. Instead, we've had a lot more detail on the pledges announced last year by President Xi Jinping to be carbon neutral by 2060 and to peak emissions by 2030. But especially on coal, which China still burns a tremendous amount of and is still adding a lot of coal power, a lot of people have been disappointed. I asked people from the Environment Ministry at a press conference today about that. Here's what they had to say.
As a developing country, China is currently facing the arduous tasks of developing the economy, improving people's livelihood, eradicating poverty and maintaining national security. There are still many practical difficulties and challenges in adjusting the energy structure which cannot be accomplished overnight.
So what you saw there was all the obstacles for China actually trying to cut down coal, and that will be deeply worrying ahead of COP. The other thing that was stressed in that press conference was how it's the responsibility of developed, wealthy nations to lead the way to drastically reduce their emissions on climate change and not for developing nations. China classes itself as a developing nation, so it's clearly saying that for breakthroughs to happen at COP, it's going to have to come from the Western countries. And that, again, puts a dampener on what we can expect. This is the mood music from Beijing ahead of COP26, ahead of Glasgow, and that mood is pretty dark right now.
Now, do stay with us, because coming up after the break, I'll be joined by Greenpeace UK's Head of Climate, Kate Blagojevich, and organic farmer and Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, Stuart Roberts. There they are standing by. We'll be discussing whether the Chancellor has budgeted for climate change and how to inspire people to make climate-friendly choices. That's after this short break.
I'm Hannah Thomas-Peter, and I'm Sky's climate change correspondent. The UK is a world leader in wind power.
Power! Power! People!
It's part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is such an important ecosystem. It's known as the lungs of Africa. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. She doesn't really enjoy speaking to the press, and it wasn't clear right up until the last moment that she was going to sit down with me.
I might be just very naive, but I do believe that change is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be climate activists.
I'm confident for the last 30 years we have known how bad it is. I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to fight for the next step.
You can see just the piles and piles of stuff, these sofas and people's desks and children's books. And you can see inside this home here, people trying to sort out their home. It's just been devastating.
I think everything's at stake. The future of our planet, the future of the beauty around us, the future of you and me.
Going on. I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Did you know if we tried to use less energy, we could help reduce air pollution? What, like turning off the lights and stuff? Yeah.
There'll be a mild windy start with rain from Cornwall up into southern Scotland and heavy showers to the west. Northern England will stay wet through the morning and Wales and southwest England will turn wet, but southern Scotland will largely dry up. Elsewhere, it'll be mostly fine, but the northwestern Scotland can expect heavy showers. It'll stay very mild. Scotland will see showers clearing later. There'll be little change elsewhere. The unsettled conditions mean air pollution levels should remain low, with levels between 1 and 3 on the daily air quality index.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with Greenpeace UK's Head of Climate, Kate Blagojevich, and organic farmer and Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, Stuart Roberts. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. Well, perhaps surprisingly, considering the Global Climate Change Summit starting in Glasgow in just a few days' time, today's budget was not dominated by spending on climate. The government did, of course, announce a whole raft of new climate measures, including its net zero strategy just last week. So was it inevitable, given the post-COVID environment, that green measures would be overshadowed in today's budget? Kate, to you first, your reaction to that?
I think that the climate emergency should have been at the heart of this autumn budget. Obviously, there were a raft of policies announced last week, but without the money to back up those policies, they're just words on paper, and that doesn't lead to any action at all. And that means that the climate targets that those policies are supposed to be hitting just simply aren't going to be reached without the money to back them up. It felt very much like Rishi Sunak was much more interested in investing in Prosecco than he was the planet.
And Stuart, your thoughts after today's budget? Of course, a lot of criticism at the lack of green spending, of course, just days ahead of COP as the host nation. What did you make of that? Was that odd to you, the optics of that, perhaps?
I think one of the things for me is, and Kate touched on this, you can't look at the budget in isolation. I think you've got to look at it alongside the net zero strategy. And look, there are still some big funding gaps there that need to be filled, as Kate said. But I also look at it through the lens of my sector, my industry. There were some things in the budget. So, for example, the announcement about business rate investment relief for on-site renewables or green technologies. That will definitely help our sector get towards net zero. There is still a lot more to be done, but it wasn't all disappointment. But there are still those funding gaps missing, and a strategy without funding isn't a strategy. We've got to have the funding that goes with it as well.
Yeah, Kate, to you next. As Stuart referenced there, you know, the government has allocated £30 billion to create new green industries of the future since March, as the Chancellor referenced once again today. Do you think that Budget Day is simply far too complex a day, far too complex in terms of its level of announcements in public spending to make those sorts of big green announcements?
I think no, because I do think that the green announcements should have been very clear from the outset. The moment that he stood up, he should have been talking about the climate crisis. We're days away from COP. We can see that extreme weather events are happening today. They're happening every single day all around the world. We're hearing from UN scientists with new reports every single day saying how we, the UK, but also globally, are not hitting the climate targets that we should be in order to try and keep temperature rises to 1.5. The Chancellor and this government do need to be doing much more than making announcements and saying targets. They need to be allocating the money to back them up.
And Stuart, just lastly on this issue, what did you make of the decision to cut air passenger duty by 50% on domestic flights? Of course, fuel duties are almost at a record high at the moment. Low-income families are really struggling. Was this a surprise to you?
I've got to say it was a surprise. As someone who actually took a decision a few years ago not to take domestic flights precisely for the environmental reasons. I was very surprised by that one. And yeah, that came a bit left field, I thought.
OK, on to our next issue now. And of course, it's a rare day when we don't mention a climate report on this show from a big international institution. And more often than not, they're telling policymakers that targets simply aren't enough, that not enough is being spent, and that we're heading for climate catastrophe. So is the message getting through to people? How difficult is it for people to work out how they can personally help on climate? Kate, to you first. You've been with Greenpeace since 2014. Have you sensed a change in the public mood?
I have, yes. I think that over the last few years, we've seen that the public are much more interested in climate change. They're much more concerned about climate change. And that's true, I think, even now, while we're in the middle of a pandemic where some people might have said, actually, climate change is going to go on a back burner for a lot of people. Actually, what's happening is that the climate emergency and tackling it is still one of the top voting issues for people. We've seen loads of polling coming out this year, basically all saying that the majority of people want the government to be taking much more climate action. They want to be spending a lot more money to make sure that the crisis is taken seriously and that the government actually acts like we're in a climate crisis, which we are, as well as obviously dealing with the pandemic and understanding that the two can actually go hand in hand and that we should be really making sure that we've got a green recovery coming out of the COVID pandemic. That's what people are really interested in now.
Yeah, very interesting. And Stuart, your thoughts on that? Typically, people wouldn't care about global issues in the middle of a recession. Are you sensing a change too in terms of what people care about and what you're hearing within the farming industry and agriculture?
I absolutely am. I think people see this as an opportunity to take stock, to change things. And I think, as Kate says, this green recovery point. If I look at the farming industry itself over the last 3, 4, 5 years, as we've been starting to talk about net zero as an industry, farmers are really feeling empowered. They feel as though they can be part of that solution. And that empowerment, I think, is really important. But it's also important, I think, at every life stage. So one of the most exciting things we've been doing is actually doing some STEM projects in classrooms with kids and actually getting them to see where agriculture butts up against and can be a solution to climate change, getting youngsters involved, getting everyone involved. And ultimately, for me, it's about empowering every single one of us as an individual to be part of that solution. And actually, it's just part of our everyday life, doing something every day to do our bit for the planet.
And Kate, there's far more information and dialogue now around about climate change, but many people, are quite a high proportion of people, find it quite confusing what they're reading on social media. Of course, MPs debating today, educating students on climate issues. But do you think they should be focusing on other generations as well?
I think, honestly, I do think that climate information needs to be very clear, very accessible, and it's what I spend quite a lot of my time thinking about, so that we can inspire everybody to get involved and to do their bit, whether that's signing petitions, whether that's getting involved in local air pollution campaigns, whether that's writing to their MPs. Obviously, we've seen the future generation of school strikers have been hugely inspiring in terms of what they've been doing and the protests that they've been holding. And so I think that there is a huge amount of work to be done still to make sure that the information is getting out there so that people can really understand it and know what needs to be done.
Really appreciate your thoughts today, Kate Blagojevich and Stuart. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's everything from us for today. Joining me on tomorrow's show is climate scientist Ella Gilbert and International Ambassador of the Conservative Environment Network, Stanley Johnson. But do stay tuned, because coming up next, of course, more on the budget. The Chancellor promising billions, but has he delivered? I'll see you tomorrow.